No, nobody's ever going to admit. Even the Catholic Church is offering 100 million, yet we paid America through Sudan, 343 million for 200 people. Why? Millions of Africans are worth less than 200. I'm not mocking those who died. It's just to remind us that this conversation is racialized.
See, I want you to pay attention and watch this video. Last I think is it last month that the Ghanaian president organized a whole conference so that the colonial masters can pay reparation to Africans. This is a Pan Africanist. Most of you know him. He's very, very passionate about Africa. His name is Brain Kagaro. I want you to listen to him and see the sense that he has made. He has made a lot of sense. Just listen to what he said.
Many people go to Cape Coast in Ghana for tourist reasons. And many people go to Robben Island in South Africa for tourist reasons. I think for the purposes of these conversations, let's agree that these are crime sins of mass atrocities, as a first thing. The second thing is to be clear that the reparations being talked about by the current movements, that's linking Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, Asia Pacific, are reparations for the following. Reparations for the enslavement of Africans and the racialized chattel slavery, reparations for colonialism, and reparations for apartheid, because it's useful that we talk about them in those entities. Why? In the sense that they speak to three things. The question of the historical factor that what became revolts or rebellions against white colonialism or European colonialism was actuated by grievances relating to forcible expropriation of property by way of imposition of taxes, by way of dispossession of land, by way, if you were the Khoi and the San in South Africa, dispossession of cattle. So there is an economic dimension to reparations. If you think about the Caribbean, white needs, white greed, white convenience, and white fragilities coincided into forming some of the wealthiest land and sugar barons in Europe, in the United Kingdom. So the link between slavery and the later stage colonialism and industrialization is one that I think that the speakers will allude to. Lastly, I just wanted us to keep in mind that slavery, the reparations is not just about compensation. Reparations is guaranteeing non-recurrence. Reparations is not just looking at the local experience. Reparations is looking at the global system that sustained it, and that global system anchored on white supremacy, but on global division of labor, and etc. I will not get into my usual conversations about repair. You know, it's almost inevitable and given that in our conversations, even black people themselves don't seem to believe that the black body is worthy of repair, unless it is in the service of capital. So the same black people who can get workmen's compensation are not seen as deserving of repair. That's number one. Number two, that each time people want to make a claim, they are told it'll suffer from statutes of limitations. That means the offender wishes or insists that their own law be applied to judge atrocities that they created and committed against the other. And then three, people seem to believe that a lot of time has passed, and therefore it is indeterminate. It's difficult for us to tell how best to do this in a logical manner. For some reason, that the harm and the hurt that our people suffer should be erased or can be erased, and yet the harm and the hurt that others suffer is not possible to erase. There was rampant rape of black women by, whether you call it the colonialists and within the slave plantations and elsewhere. And when this happened, the mixed race children were forcibly taken away from their mothers. amongst other things. And I think all of you can link this. The irony is not only were these folks compensated at the end of slavery, those of you who got independence will know that they were also compensated when you were getting your independence. So there's been a consistent system of reparations of the oppressor, the colonizer, and etc. The abiding question is, when the French lose and they punitively impose a financial burden on Haiti that lasts for scores of years and Haiti is impoverished, what do you call that act of demanding that you make good to Haiti and Haitians? An act of economic sabotage that has kept them imperiled, impoverished. When the French, at the point of decolonization, imposed on Sahelian nations in this region, in the Sahel, restrictions with respect to their economy and financial systems that essentially mean that none of their natural resources can effectively lead to their prosperity, and they are kept in perpetual servitude. What do you call the act of making good the years of theft of those goods? Just to remind us that when Lumumba's tooth was returned to the DRC, there was no acceptance of the violence that attended the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. That when Sudan went through its intifada, the revolution recently, the Americans insisted that Sudan should pay reparations or compensation to the sum of 343 million in order to be taken off the terrorism list, in part because it was alleged that Osama bin Laden had been hiding in Sudan planning the bombings of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And the Sudanese people who had just freed themselves from dictatorship were made to pay 343 million as reparations. In 2015, the United States, through Congress, passed an act holding liable companies in Germany that were responsible for the Holocaust. The legal systems were set up to always find the empire innocent and the oppressed. I think what we've been reminded is that this holistic approach must look at physical violence and maybe psychological and emotional, but also must look at the collective violence, structural violence, including erasure of cultures, of knowledge, of innovations, of science. Things that are now being addressed as issues of development and issues of governance are actually fundamentally questions of justice or injustice. Just to remind us, it's reparations for slavery, for colonial extraction, and for apartheid. And there's a lot of research that's been done. What I find interesting, though, is each time harm has been done to white people, and I've been deliberate in saying what Sudan was forced to pay. Nobody talked about proving nexus. Sudan was made to pay the 343 million, Libya was made to pay the 600 million, the Holocaust, right? The payments has been made, Japan, for the comfort of women, payment made. There's always an arithmetical problem somehow when it comes to black people. I come from a small country called Zimbabwe. When the colonial forces were occupying my country, a young girl, 26-year-old, felt she had been possessed and directed by the spirit of a great female warrior called Nehanda. She led the men of my country to fight against colonial occupation. The colonial government hung her where the State House sits today. Her crime was treason. The only state that existed at the time she was hung was the state for which she was fighting in defense of. Having defeated Chief Chengaira and other chiefs, the colonial company that occupied our country decapitated their heads and took them to the United Kingdom as trophies in museums. The story of my ancestors is the same story of Sarah Batman, who was taken as an artifact because white folk couldn't get over her bodily parts. It's the same story across the continent, where they took gods and they call them now artifacts. And once you have degraded gods into artifacts, you return them as a point of charity. My sister Fumi, Professor Fumi, my sister Mshai, many other sisters in the room have over the years in trying to teach me, reminded me of what happens in our villages. An elderly male rapes an underage girl, and because of poverty, insists that in order to avoid accountability, they'll make the child their bride. The crime is hidden in what appears to be an act of magnanimity. The criminal is called a breadwinner. We cannot allow what happens to our daughters in our villages to happen to our continent. A criminal cannot be absolved purely by paying dowry, because that same criminal will keep raping. My brothers and sisters, I was remotely involved in the Abacha loot and Mobutu loot conversations and processes. The Swiss refused and insisted, Professor Olukoshi is here, that we should prove that the money was actually public money. That in the absence of proof, they were not willing to return the interest. To this day, the Swiss have not returned the full amounts. The real criminal at law, anybody who receives stolen property under all our legal systems, is a thief. And yet Transparency International and all our ranking agencies will tell you that the cleanest country in the world is Switzerland. It was the Swiss bankers who forced Mozambique into taking a loan that it did not need, and we arrested the Mozambican finance minister in the 2 billion scandal. Somehow, Credit Suisse and others somehow escaped liability for having transacted. What am I saying? I'm not saying that we should excuse our people. I'm just reminding us of what already exists. University of Western Cape has set up something, a desk, a center to deal with reparations. University of West Indies, together with Glasgow, Codestria, Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, International Law Center, Pan African Lawyers Union, and several African entities have started doing this. The meeting today was to say it's inadequate to have a few of us. I am not trying to prove myself, my pain, to any European. I'm not trying to make legal or technical sense. You ask a rape victim to prove she was raped? How did Leopold's Congo become Leopold's? My brothers and sisters, there's no Tarzan raised by monkeys that's going to come and save us and fight against the predatory instinct of recolonization. We're not going to negotiate ourselves out of the quagmire we find ourselves in, where globalization is militarized and financialized, by pleading the accuracy of the mathematics of the extent to which we've been looted. No, nobody's ever going to admit. Even the Catholic Church is offering 100 million, yet we paid America through Sudan, 343 million for 200 people. Why? Millions of Africans are worth less than 200. I'm not mocking those who died. It's just to remind us that this conversation is racialized. It's racialized because even amongst ourselves, we have bought this logic. This logic that actually says, for some reason, we must make sense to the thief, to the looter, to the robber. We must make sense to the rapist. We must make sense to ourselves. Do we have bad governments? We have terrible governments. But the Americans, Madam Chair, have worse. Kissinger, who died recently, Finally, history has begun to judge him. And yet our kids studying international relations were studying the Kissinger doctrine. Whitewashed, enslaved, and etc. I was a lawyer, and I think a reasonable lawyer, as my friends here will tell you. And accounting firms, consultancy firms, bankers, every day are continuing the legacy of slavery, of colonialism. The African Development Bank is supporting my government to pay reparations to white commercial farmers. Nobody has asked what formula did they use. My sister, they'd borrowed from banks when the land was expropriated in the national interests. Nobody has asked, can you show us how much you owed so that we deduct what we're paying you? No. The premise and basis of international re-engagement set under the Cotonou Agreement and insisted upon by the Americans under Zidera is pay first, and then we'll talk later. Now, here is an understanding we must get. My ancestors, Ayob, the Monday Charter of 1325, passed not far from here, the first written constitution in the world. It wasn't the French, it was an African, the Monday Charter. It had in it reparations as a principle. Shona culture, Kikuyu culture, Hausa culture, Yoruba culture, all of them have repair as a central piece. So as we go home having discussed reparations, the fundamental question is, how do we produce the knowledge, the scholarship? How do we produce the public narrative? How do we produce the dialogues? Not to end, because we're not going to win the reparations argument tomorrow. It will suffice if everyone in this group starts a fire that keeps burning 20, 30 years from now. Because what was stolen and the discovery of what was stolen, none of the speakers talked about technology, inventions done by slaves, by black people under colonialism and under apartheid. Nobody talked about that. Nobody talked about how the Royal Dutch Company stole from the Khoi and the San cattle that made them wealthy, that they sold to other people. Nobody. My friends, nobody talked about your ancestors who worked for free labor. Free labor, rendered free labor. And how do I quantify that? Easy. The colonial system that sent my ancestors underground into mines and did not pay them, that forced them to come and work on white plantation by imposing taxation on them. It documented how much tax it was collecting from the natives. Now the granddaughters and the grandsons of the natives are here. It's payback time. Thank you.